Hello, my dear friends. You're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 21st of September. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. As you know, the President of Russian Federation announced about partial mobilization. The Russians are planning to mobilize up to 300,000 soldiers. And they're planning to mobilize those one who left the army during the previous 10 years. The Russians are saying that the number of their reserves is around 25 million soldiers. If we're talking about the people who served in army and who is not older than 50 years, and the Russians are saying they're planning to mobilize just a little bit more than 1%, just 300,000. Today I talk a lot with the Russians, with some people from Russian Federation, and some of them have already reported and told me that some of them or their relatives or friends received this notification, and mainly the Russians are trying to mobilize right now those one who served in army and who have combat experience in Chechnya and Syria, in any other place in Africa and so on. So this is the first wave of mobilization. Those one who had in previous the combat experience. If the Russians are planning to mobilize up to soldiers, people who is less than 50 years, that means that there might be a lot of people who served in Chechnya, because as you know, the Chechen campaign ended just at the early 2000s, so less than something around 20 years ago. So I believe that they do have possibility to mobilize like men from 40 till 50 years who had combat experience, these like to set them as sergeants or something like this, or like low rank officers and so on. The question is if whether going to be nuclear war, nuclear attack or not, whether Russians are planning to continue their offensive operation or not. If we are talking about the speech of President of Russian Federation, he didn't say anything about continue of developing their like territory under their control. He didn't say anything about upcoming or further offensive operation in the south. If we're talking about the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, Shoigu, he didn't say anything as well. So there were no reports about any offensive operation, and that the Russians are planning to use these mobilized forces to continue offensive operation in Ukraine, let's say to take Kharkiv or to take Nikolaev or Odessa. They didn't say anything about that. The only thing they told that if anybody is planning to become a part of conflict, of course they will use the nuclear weapon for these purposes. You need to understand something about the Russian nuclear weapon. First of all, they have a very big range of nuclear power, of nuclear rockets, and they have nuclear rockets that are able, let's say, to destroy just Avdiivka and without any consequences to Donetsk region. There is a very big range of nuclear weapon. I believe that Western countries also has such a weapon. So the Russians are planning to mobilize 300,000 soldiers. And as you see, everything is according to everything we discussed in my videos. The Russians, as soon as they join the Kherson district, Zaporozhye district as a part of Russian Federation, this territory will become a part of Russian Federation. So that's why they need and they will move their regular army on this position, trying to stabilize situations in this area and trying to protect the civilians and locals from this area. So everything as we discussed. So I'll remind you one more time, the Russians are planning to hold referendum in Kherson, Zaporozhye, DPR, LPR. There is no updates about the territory between Kharkiv and LPR, but I believe that this territory, the Russians are planning to join this territory as a part of LPR, and the same situation the Russians are planning to do with Snegirivka, because this town is a part of Nikolaev region, but I believe that the Russians are planning to join this town and make it as a part of Kherson district. And the question is, the most important question is about Zaporozhye, because Zaporozhye, as you can see, is the part of Zaporozhye region. More than 60% is going to join Russian Federation, and the north of Zaporozhye area is still under Ukrainian control. The question is whether the Russians are planning to storm Zaporozhye and to complete and to turn control over the entire area. I believe they will. But not earlier than the next year, because the most important question about those 300,000 soldiers is not the number. The most important question is the timings, when the Russians are able to deploy these 300,000 soldiers. And I believe that the Russians are able to deploy these 300,000 soldiers not earlier than in 3 months. So maybe somewhere in December, in the beginning of January, they will be able to send these 300,000 soldiers. And if we are talking about the Ukrainians, that means that Ukrainians still have time, also the same 3 months, to do something in this area. Because as soon as the Russians will be able to deploy, the Ukrainians won't be able to do anything. Because if we're talking about the numbers, the Ukrainians have around 1 million army. It's like their official number. These forces include territorial defense, special forces, police, and so on, and also those forces that are located on the border with Belarus. And that's a lot, believe me. If we're talking about the Russians, the only number I have that approximately there are around 250,000 soldiers on the territory of Ukraine, on the south of Ukraine, in LPR, DPR, Zaporozhye, and Kherson district, around 250,000. So as you can see, 4 times less. And I believe if the Russians are able to deploy another 300,000, so that means that the Russians will have around 550,000 against 1 million army. But I'll repeat one more time that this 1 million includes the forces on the border with Belarus, the police departments, and everything. So I believe that the ratio will be somewhere 1-to-1, or maybe the Russians will be able to have a bigger number on some front lines. What the Russians, and this is very important, what the Russians are planning to do with these forces, and my understanding of the situation that we're going to see 400% on the territory of Ukraine. Anyway, the Russians will try to liberate or return control or take control over entire Donetsk region, over this territory. This is exactly what the Russians are planning and are going to do, because this is like their main goal of this special operation, and of course they need to push Ukrainians from Donetsk region to save this town and to make the life in this town possible. But today, these days, it's impossible to live there, because Ukrainians not only attack and shelling this town, also they're mining this area using the distance method of mining. Of course, I believe that the Russians maybe will try to establish control over Zaporozhye, because Zaporozhye is a part of Zaporozhye region. So that's why they can do this, and they have possibilities to do this. And this is like the minimal thing that the Russians may do during the upcoming year. But I believe that these territories that is under these two lines that the Russians will try to take control over, we won't see even in this year. I believe that this is the goals for upcoming year campaign. And anyway, the Russians will try to freeze this conflict. I believe so, because the 2024 is the election year for president of Russian Federation. And so that's why I believe that Putin wants to freeze this conflict, or at least to announce about some kind of victory. So that's why he needs at least half a year of peacetime, when there is no war, no shelling, no heavy fightings, and so on. So that's why I believe that these territories is nice and normal goals that the Russians can achieve during the upcoming 8 or 9 months. Because if we're talking about more, I'm not sure that the Russians are able to do this, because to do more, I believe that the Russians will have a lot of losses during storm of Zaporozhye. Anyway, it's like town. I'm not talking, of course, about 100,000 and so on, but I'm talking about like 10,000 or something like this. They will have losses during the storm operation of Slamensk-Kramatorsk. and they will have to spend a lot of time to do this, because as you can see, the Russians, the only part of Frontline where the Russians is active is Bakhmut, but as you see, the Russians are trying to take this town for 2 or 3 months in a row. Furthermore, sometimes they are forced to stop because, let's say, the Ukrainians managed to penetrate the Russian defense near Bilogorovka, and furthermore, the Ukrainians managed to penetrate the Russian defense near Sporne. So that's why the Russians were forced to take Bakhmut Wagner groups and to move them to Sporne and Bilogorovka just to stop the Ukrainians. So as you can see, they don't have a lot of possibilities to do storm operation or to develop their bridgeheads all along the front line. So, and as we talked at the beginning about the timings of deploy, the Russians will be able to deploy this mobilized reserve just in few months, because they need to do trainings, they need to connect forces, they need to pass all necessary things to prepare this army. But because I believe that the Russians are not planning to send these forces just like without any practice, without any trainings, and it's not the prisoners from as the Wagners are trying to recruit. This is the persons, the people who has families, and of course the Russians, they don't want to have panic. They don't have problems on the mainland. They need to do everything to prepare these soldiers to be on the safe side and to be able to not to die in the first hours when being deployed on this territory. So of course they will try to teach. And of course we need to understand that if Ukrainians starts any counter-offensive operation in the south, maybe in this case the Russians will be forced to move the first wave of mobilization to the south, trying to stop the Ukrainians. If we're talking about the Ukrainians, they're in a silent panic, because there are not much comments all along from Ukrainian sources. They're just trying to. The only thing that Ukrainians are trying to do, and the Western media are trying to do, to make as much as possible damage to this mobilization, like using the verbal methods, like saying that's the problem, trying to show the picture of people from Russia who are trying to evacuate, to run away, to escape this mobilization. So they're trying just to unstabilize the situation in entire Russia, but they're not doing anything more. Furthermore, some sources are saying that there is a panic in Ukraine, in their authorities, because they understand that they can't do anything about this mobilization. And even this is not the most important part. Let's say if we're talking about 19th century, 18th century, if a country do or report or announce about mobilization, the first thing that the neighbors of this country do is that they're also announcing about mobilization. Almost at the same day, almost in a few hours. But what do we see right now? We see that the Russians announced about mobilization. They're planning to increase their army in Ukraine up to almost 600,000 soldiers. Also, the Russians have another 2 million army. But as you can see, we haven't heard any reports from Poland, from Romania, from Lithuania, from Baltic states, from Turkey. These countries haven't announced about their mobilization. And this is the main problem for the Ukrainian authorities. They see that nobody do anything all along the border. Nobody does anything or did anything in Poland, in Romania, in Lithuania, in Germany, even in the United States of America. Of course, just like 10 hours passed since the report of Putin, and maybe the Western countries are going to announce about mobilization in upcoming days. But anyway, I believe that they're not going to do this because they have NATO and so on, but NATO is not enough even to stop this 600,000 mobilized trained army. And we understand that if Ukrainians will be defeated, in this case the Russians will be able to mobilize the locals from the Ukraine itself, and the Russians will be able to mobilize by the end of this conflict. If the Russians are planning to move till Lvov or Rovno or something, till the west Ukraine, they will be able by the end of this conflict mobilized up to 1 million soldiers. That will be consist, let's say, 60% of forces from the Russian Federation, LPR, DPR, and Kherson district, and up to 40% from Ukraine. Those people who used to be the soldiers of Ukrainian army, but if the Ukraine will be defeated, then they will become automatically a part of, let's say, new Russian army. And this is a very big problem, and I believe that the Western countries understand this, but we will see what are they going to do this. My understanding, if the Western countries want to show the Ukraine that everything is okay, we are with you, they need to announce about mobilization as well. Even if they're not planning to start human mobilization, at least the Western countries need to report about industrial mobilization. At least this will be like a signal that we are on the same side and we are at the same race. So what does it mean to be on the same race? That means that now the Russians mobilized industry, human resource, and so on, and they're moving they have a very big distance with the Western countries in all these questions. And if the Western countries are not going to reduce this distance, that means that the Russians don't need to worry about anything. In a year, in a 2, in a month, or in a half a year, they will be able to take control over entire Ukraine, and they will have no problems with the Western countries, just sanctions and restrictions from the Western world. But to tell the truth, it's nothing. In 10 years, all these sanctions might be like closed or like, I don't know, abandoned or something like this. Now, let's talk about the situation on the ground. The front line is stable. The Russians are not planning to do anything these days. The only thing they need is to protect and defend the south of Ukraine and LPR and DPR. And they're doing this right now. The only thing that they're doing new trenches. This is the only thing they're doing. And they're bringing more ammunition on the front line and shells just to be on the safe side and to be ready for any provocation from the Ukrainian side. If we're talking about the Ukrainians, yes, they're doing something. First of all, today we got report that Ukrainians started demining process near Donetsk, between Krasnogorovka and Staromikhailivka, in this area. If you remember a few days ago, I told you that the Russians managed to enter Krasnogorovka and that there are heavy clashes in the town, but I believe that maybe the Russians were pushed back, and now the Ukrainians start demining process in this area. Maybe it's a fake flag. Maybe they're not planning to do anything, but anyway, of course, it's some kind of media war and they want to make panic in town, trying to show that if you're planning to do referendum, then we are going to start offensive operation at these days. If we're talking about the report of Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, they're saying that, let's take a look at the map of this position, that during the previous hours, the 28th Mechanized Brigade were trying to attack Pravda. There is a fire icon near this town. And during those attempts, they were defeated, and the losses of that brigade is around 200 soldiers, 21 armored vehicles. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that some campaigns from this brigade were sent on the minefields. I don't know why did they do this. Maybe they didn't know that there was mines, but those mines was Ukrainian mines. But anyway, some few campaigns were destroyed just on their self-mines. If we're talking about other front lines, also the Russians are saying that they attacked Artyomovsk, this town, during the previous hours, and they just attacked the 93rd Mechanized Brigade in this area, and the loss of this brigade is around 75 soldiers and 9 armored vehicles. Another important update are coming from the from south of Ukraine, from Donetsk south area, from Pavlovka. The Ukrainians deployed here the special first President Brigade. The Russians spotted this brigade, attacked, and the loss of that brigade is around 60 soldiers and 12 armored vehicles. So this is the situation about this area. And the most difficult situation, of course, near a town by the name of Liman. The Ukrainians understand, they understand the situation with mobilization. They haven't made any decision about that mobilization. They still wait about reaction from the Western countries about their support. So that's why they still are doing the same thing as they did before. So they're trying to storm this side of Seversky Donetsk River, the Russian side, trying to establish bridgehead. There are very heavy clashes there. And I believe that the Russians, they still hold this position, but it is very difficult for them because the Ukrainian sources, human sources, are endless. This is one thing, and the second, that as you can see, there is a big forest along the front line, and it's not very easy to spot the movements of troops and infantry in this forest. It's impossible to move a lot of armored vehicles on this side of the river. Or if you are able to do this, there are just few places where you can do this. Let's say near Yampol, you can cross a river with armored vehicles. So you can do this everywhere where there's no forest, but there are a lot of forest. So that's why you are able to use your infantry and troops, commandos, and they're doing this. And these days, the Russians started shelling another water reservoir. This one, this Seversky Donetsk water reservoir, it's very big, as you can see. The Russians are attacking them with one purpose, to destroy those dams and to increase the level of Seversky Donetsk river. If we take a look at the Western sources map, this is this reservoir, and the Russians are attacking these dams and they want to increase. But most of the Russian military experts are saying that yes, they will be able to have some benefits from these attacks, but the benefits from attacking them near Seversky Donetsk, it's not the same as the benefits from attacking this Karachunsk water reserve, because the level of the water in this will be increased, but not for a very long time. And the Russians understand this. With these attacks, they will be able to win, let's say, a few weeks, 1 or 2 weeks. To tell the truth, it's enough because the rainy period is right in front, is coming, and anyway, in the months there are going to be a lot of rains, and the level of the river is going to rise anyway. So the Russians did this just one thing, to reduce Ukrainians' pressure on the Seversky Donetsk river. That means that situation there is very difficult, because if everything was fine, of course they wouldn't do anything like that. As you can see, furthermore, as you can see on the front lines, you see that there are a lot of bombing and shelling along the south of Ukraine. And this is the possible area where the Ukrainians will try to start counteroffensive operation, if they will. Because tomorrow is the 22nd of September. This is the final day, we can say, before the referendum. The question is when the Ukrainians are planning to start offensive operation, or on the 22nd or on morning of the 23rd. I believe that if they start, they need to start this counteroffensive operation tomorrow. Of course, there are going to be a lot of losses from the Ukrainian side, I believe that, but they don't have any other option. Or the Ukrainians need to accept the reality, and they need to accept the situation that the Russians, now that territory is under Russian control, and with help of this, they will be able to save their manpower. And they need, if we're talking about the Ukrainians, they need to do in this situation as the Russians did in Kharkiv. The Russians left Kharkiv, they lost a lot of territories, a lot of pro-Russian people, but they managed to save the army. If the Ukrainians want to be on the safe side, if they want to win a little bit more time, they need to accept these referendums. They need to accept that this territory is going to be a part of Russia, and they need to save their army for upcoming counteroffensive operation when they will be able to do this. And they will be able to do this as soon as the level of the water in Oskol River will go down. After that, they will be able to do something. But that will be totally different story, because in this case, this is going to be not the war on the territory of Ukraine, but according to the Russian sources, it will be the war on the territory of Russian Federation. This is going to be totally different situation. I would like to remind you about two things, very important two things. First one, if you remember a few weeks ago, I told you that the Russians accumulated around 700 air units along the border with Ukraine, 700, including helicopters and aircrafts, 700. And furthermore, about Belarus, that I believe that as soon as the Ukrainians starts offensive operation against the territory of Russian Federation already, I believe that Belarus is going to start its own mobilization, not to help the Russians or to move forces, but just to be on the safe side and just to keep everybody stressed around this country, and just to show that the flanks of Russian Federation is under safe protection. So I believe that they're planning to do the same as well. And of course, this also not a very good thing for Ukrainians, because in this case they will have to keep more forces on this border, and it will force Poland to keep forces on this line and the Baltic states on the north. So this is the upcoming events during this autumn and winter. And that's it for today. Military Summer channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.